As you know, Apropos is a literary journal focused on demonstrating the symbiotic relationship between arts and our digital culture. Can you tell us a little about your familiarity with various art forms and your experience with technology?
Well, I've been working in arts and humanities for the last 10 or 12 years in the university, both as a graduate student in literature and then as a professor at the City University of New York and then as an instructional technologist here at Mary Washington. And I guess I've kind of moved from kind of the focus from the academy to the focus on a kind of very different, I think, a digital relationship to the idea of art and to the kind of idea of art, particularly in our moment. And I don't know what it is, and I don't know if we fully understand what art is in our moment, which I think is what makes it interesting to think about. But that's kind of my relationship. It's a loose relationship because I don't consider myself an artist, nor do I necessarily consider myself an academic. I kind of consider myself, in many ways, a practitioner and very much embedded within the culture in which we're experiencing a transformation of art, or at least what I think, in particular through the digital. So.
Okay, and so do you feel that these forces of technology and art are capable of elevating one another, conversing with one another, or do you view them as kind of opposing forces that are being shoved together?
Well, I don't, it's funny because that's where we're starting to see this conversation go, right?
Yeah.
It's either is technology killing art, right? And
exactly.
Just recently, Zadie Smith, who's a novelist, pretty accomplished novelist, 35 years old, kind of trying to speak on the idea of the social network and your generation, which she's calling Generation Y. And I think it's just fascinating, like there's the idea that technology is killing communication and alienating you and killing art. And then the other side is starting to emerge is, technology has also broadened and democratized the process of participation.
Yeah.
And if Academy is kind of always talking about heteroglossia and many voices and different visions, well, what happens when the internet makes that happen?
Yeah.
And those voices aren't going to be very well kind of versed in terms of, the canon or grammar or so many things we take for granted right now.
Do you think that'll lead to an expansion of the canon?
I think it will change the canon. I really do. And, the canon's been under question for decades. I mean, that's kind of, you see that come up again. And I think in many ways, one of the things we'll start to see with the digital media is it will both reinforce a lot of questions about the canon, but it also, I think, hopefully, diversify it. And diversify the canon and the construction of the canon outside of the academy.
Yeah.
Which is, a powerful idea, and it's something that academics would have problems with, obviously.
Right. So you touched on this a little bit, but why do you think there is this sort of dual sphere mentality about technology and the arts, and how people believe that art in some way rejects technology or technology diminishes art?
Yeah. Well, it goes off a rant that I've been doing recently in my digital storytelling class.
Yeah.
But it's the idea of, I think about the technology and the internet in particular, because that's really defining what's driving technology in our moment.
Sure.
Is social networking and the idea of the network. Well, it's a radical idea, and it's only 18 years old, really. It's as old as most of you right now.
Yeah.
It's not. I've only been on the internet half my life, but it's the generative part of my life. When I started college, that's when the internet started to emerge. But the internet, in my mind, is very much like film, right? 100 years ago, 1910, 1909, you had this new upstart medium, film. It was a popular medium. It was a medium that literature kind of professors and kind of the elite, the idea, didn't want to accept, didn't recognize. It was the kind of medium of the unwashed masses. And obviously, the birth and evolution of cinema over the last 100 years has been marvelous. And we've seen the emergence of cinema, some amazing, like The Godfather. Think about great films that kind of frame the kind of, apotheosis of that form. And we are just yet to begin that with the internet and to understand how the internet will inform itself and kind of develop and mature as a medium for art.
So you're kind of saying that you think that art is going to sort of further this idea of intertextuality?
Yeah. Well, I think art as a concept is going to, I don't think art as a concept will change.
Right.
But I think we'll start to see what we understand as art on the internet emerge.
Right.
And I think we're starting to see the early signs of that. And there are historians who will come back and talk about this moment.
Right.
And talk about the fact that there was an encyclopedia filled with millions of articles made by common people who weren't necessarily scholars. And Wikipedia is an artwork.
Yeah.
I mean, think about it. It's both a
Collaboratively.
very formative and useful, functional tool, but it's also, when you think about it, it's an amazing collaborative artwork.
Yeah.
You know, and I don't know, maybe that's a very loose definition of art, but I also think we have to come to the internet with some loose definitions because we've never seen a medium like this before. The way in which, like film, it takes mediums before it writing, photography, and music, and it blends them. Well, now we have that blend on the internet, but we also have interactivity
Yeah.
and participation, which is a whole different psychological kind of element to the whole notion of art.
Yeah, what does it do to art? Does it bring the conversation of art to the masses, and what does it do to your audience?
And do you and I, and I'm of the mindset that like it's not like before the internet art wasn't participatory.
Right.
When you read a book, when you read a novel, you participated in it. Right? It was part of you. You basically couldn't share it as easily, maybe. But the idea now is the participation is so easy to share and track. And the fact that you can now interact with an artist, Neil Gaiman, you can follow him on Twitter, right? The guy will probably talk to you. He's so social and cool, it seems. But the other thing is how much of now are the actual audience and the fans informing the art, right? Helping, either TV shows, movies, or novelists frame and write the art. Musicians. I mean, it's kind of a notion where you feel like maybe you're part of the process. And maybe that's a false sense of involvement. I mean, I see people can say, oh, yeah, it's just kind of selling you as part. But, you watch shows like Lost, and I'm not saying Lost is necessarily art. But, man, Lost had a serious following of fans that were hardcore about developing the story, narrating it, and actually holding the writers accountable at any given moment. And that affects the process of creation.
Yeah.
And if art is a process of creation and in creation of the best works, then how can we think that that's not going to change the way in which we think of creation? Because creation as a form has always, or not always, but has, at least in the modern moment, been understood as a singular act. Right? The act of the genius, the act of the creative. Not to say it hasn't been, right? I mean, William Faulkner, still for me the greatest artist of the 20th century. But to say that, and then to look how art could potentially now be distributed in so many different ways, right? And related in so many different ways and shared in so many different ways. It's not like that wasn't the case before the internet, but it's almost as if it's so apparent now.
Right.
Like we can't necessarily sit so comfortably with the idea of the individual artist or author as genius in isolation. I think that's the problem. Not that they aren't geniuses, but we don't live in a creative world of isolation to the degree we might have, historically. Although, I'm sure there's a historian who can come in and say, well, in fact, it's never been in isolation. It's always been a context.
Emily Dickinson comes to mind, in her little house.
A perfect example, actually.
Yeah. But there are still those who do believe that there is this rigid divide between technology and art, and they just aren't compatible. Yeah. What do you think that these people need to realize about the future of art and technology? Do you think that the future of technology will push art aside? Do you think that they'll coalesce? Will their relationship improve, stay the same?
I don't know. I mean, take a form, right? I mean, this is, for me, is indicative. And I don't know if I'm going to answer your question, but I'm going to try because it's a tough one. I don't think, the short answer is, I don't think art and technology are going to kind of like separate and go their own ways, or that technology is going to consume art within it. I think art is still a much greater force than technology. But I do think technology will inform on certain levels how we see, experience, and feel art. And I think that's a big point. But just think about video games. Like, no one's really talking about video games as art, right?
Yeah.
And maybe for the right reasons, maybe for the wrong. But you start to see the emergence of a form and the building of a landscape and an environment that's quite complex and that's immersive. And I wonder at what point our art is going to be a lot more immersive based on technology. How in which there's going to be new forms and new mediums that aren't going to make the old mediums outdated. It's going to make them that much more special. But it's going to actually immerse us in a piece of art and immerse us in a kind of relationship to a world. And frankly, that's something artists haven't been able to do in a particular way yet. And so this is interesting because it's absolutely a whole new landscape for what art can be.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that because I immediately thought of gamers and how they judge games based on the graphics and the plot, and you're having people with literature degrees having to write these stories.
That's
you
right.
know,
Absolutely.
teaming up with computer scientists who are developing the graphics and the CGI. So it's kind of interesting.
And the thing about gamers, and we can move on, but the other thing about games that I think people probably recognize now, particularly your generation, but my generation may not, is that you always think of cinema and Hollywood as the form. At least for me, it was the form of my childhood and growing up. But as far as a market, it's about it's not nearly as powerful in terms of bringing in money and in terms of what's going to dictate the framework for what is created. So we also have to think about art is going to be more and more a popular endeavor, right? It's going to be a popular endeavor where you see it emerge out of these popular forms and someone takes it and creates something totally wild. But like Claudia Emerson always says, it's like you have to recognize that tradition. And that tradition is going to come from all different places now in the digital space. So it's going to be very interesting, and it's a form that we've been talking about in digital storytelling a lot, is the mashup. How is the mashup art, right? How do we think of the ability to remix and to kind of comment upon and transcend two independent pieces to make something greater? And we know that T.S. Eliot has talked about this. John Donne has this idea of kind of remixing, or not really remixing, but taking two very distinct conceits.
Yeah.
And by bringing them together, creating something wholly new and powerful, right? And he does that in The Valediction Forbidding Mourning, right? There's a beautiful use of the compass to talk about how his wife and he are separate, but then come together. It's just this beautiful mashed up conceit. And it's like the mashup's been around for centuries, but now we're seeing people able to mash up the culture that they've been kind of, I don't want to say like force fed.
Yeah, but think about Facebook and apps and all these kinds of these plugins and programs that you use on an everyday basis that are a collection of other people's works and other people's programs and Creative Commons and the ability to use other people's even code in your code.
That's right.
Is very interesting.
And how you start to get a kind of ecosystem of sharing and an ecosystem of creation. And I do think, I don't think there's any greater creative force right now than the idea of people out there doing it out of some obsession.
Yeah.
I think, and you see, whether someone's obsession is, right, I don't know, go from the craziest thing to like Halo, right? Mm-hmm. And people obsess and create these insane fan fiction videos about this video game. Or if it's something like Emily Dickinson, which, I think it would be a lot easier for the Academy to relate to that obsession with Emily Dickinson than maybe Halo. But that obsession is a generative force that's driving creativity. And how can we, as a culture, ignore that creativity is not going to give way to some of our great artworks? They're not all great. They're not all art. But that force, that creative force is there, and it's demonstrable anywhere you go, on YouTube, on Facebook, on Twitter. It's all there. You don't have to look that far. You see the viral videos. Like, how do we understand the kind of social phenomenon that is viral videos? Like, and how do we understand that potentially as an art form?
YouTube, even.
Yeah, think about it.
And the ability to share YouTube.
When I think about YouTube, it's like the public space that we no longer have. Like, we no longer, public spaces are going away. Right? Mm-hmm. And YouTube is not a public space. It's owned by Google, right? The people who control copyright are right in there reading every video you've done. So it's not. I don't want to pretend like it's this great open space. But let's face it, it is this open space that people are putting stuff on, thousands and thousands of hours of video a day. And some of it's awesome. You know what I mean? And most of it is just created in some kid's basement.
Yeah.
It's just amazing. What do we do with that? And everyone who has one of these machines has a force of creation. Yeah. How can we ignore that as art? How can we ignore the fact that the poetry of the future, and I think of the first, and Claudia Emerson has talked about this at length, and I've talked about it with her, it's like the metaphors and the poetry we need right now is poetry for us to help conceptualize the shift. And it's a technical shift, as much as it is a creative shift, a cultural shift, a social shift, an economic shift, all these things. We need the language, and that's still going to come from the poets. It's still going to come from the artists. So as an artist in this moment, it would be a wonderful time to be an artist because you have to invent new languages
Mm-hmm.
and, invent new terms. Just reframe everything we see now because it's almost all new.